Somebody else, but
Yeah, I've been there before.
yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
He's in Jamaica.
How you getting along?
All right.
Good, good.
I just got back from San Jose.
From?
I'm on San Jose.
Oh,
I'm
okay.
all the way around outside island.
Yeah, and I tell you how I
I'm
do
really on the
that.
ground.
I went to swimming, of course I go later, and he was leaving, and he said to the lady at the desk, well, I won't see you for 3 weeks.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
But he
Well,
travels a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's a nice guy.
Kind of come a little bit full circle from about 76, 77 to 83, I lived in Happy.
Mm-hmm.
Had a little house over on the other side of Oak Hill from the library.
I see.
And
Dan Matthews' neighbor. Yeah.
I don't remember all of too many of the folks there. There was the Pigotts lived next door.
For part of that, I, at least from 80 to 83, I lived in the same house I live in now.
I think across the street was Mickey Sironko.
Oh, yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah. But got a master's degree in city management from East Tennessee State. Worked for about, did an internship in Bristol, Tennessee for 6 months, and then got a job in Norris, Tennessee. Was there for a little over 4 years, moved to Harrisburg. My wife said she was done moving, so they kept me for the next almost 29 years. Retired in January of 2016. Signed on with the Berkeley Group as a consultant or executive manager. Mid-16. Hadn't really done anything for them. I got a call from the mayor and got a call from the folks at the Berkeley.
I should have something.
End of September.
Okay, okay.
Very quickly found out that I was back to work.
Correct.
Well, welcome to Abbey.
In your old hotel. Your old hotel.
Kind of come full circle. So. A lot of things are recognizable and the same, and a lot of things have changed since then.
That's true. That's true.
Hopefully, good things will never change.
I live on Oak Hill Street for a while, with the house sort of down under the canyon.
Okay. There's two little kind of cream-colored ranch houses on the right as you come down over the hill. We had the second one.
Cool.
And Mickey Sironko went back to school when she was older, and she was at Emory and Henry when I was there. And she ended up getting a teaching degree and coming back and becoming a teacher. So I knew her. For some
My
reason.
wife taught for several years at Bethel Elementary.
Where?
Bethel.
Hmm.
Jason, we need to wait on her to get back, or she got things
Well, I
rolling
was,
for us.
well, I was hoping to get a hold of Mr. Bell again.
Oh, okay.
Concurred
Okay.
that he'd be here, so just want to make sure that he.
I have something to add to the agenda about
Yes,
the
sir.
Economic Development Authority.
Yes,
If
sir.
we could do that. Basically, it's Al going over the same stuff we went over with the council. I just thought it would be wise to do that with this group. And
That was good.
Tanya furnished me a report of all the stuff she's been doing that she furnished to the council in September. And, you know, I thought again, that'd be something that would be good for this group to see.
Sure, sure. That was a good presentation. Real good.
You know, the great thing about doing something like that is you can't see the people behind you. I will tell you, remember the year that we did that thing in the Frolics where me and Josh were in diapers?
Yes.
Well, during that performance, I looked out and I saw Jack McCready in the audience. And you know, Jack, he's got red hair. His face was bright red. He was laughing so hard. about 6 weeks later, I had to go before the Board of Supervisors to talk about the library. And I got up there, and of course, they, at that time, this was the old place, and they sat way up in the back. Everybody in there was grin-faced looking at me except Jack McCready. He was red-faced, and I could just see him sitting there thinking, so I knew exactly what he was thinking.
I'm sorry?
She got his voicemail.
Oh, okay.
So hopefully
He'll be here by the
Yeah,
time.
but we can start with the
Let's do that. Excuse me. I'd like to call a regular meeting of the Town of Abilene Planning Commission to order. The October 22nd meeting. Could we have a roll call for attendance purposes, please?
Mr. Anderson.
Here.
Mr. Wilson.
Here.
Dr. White is absent. Mr. Bradley.
Here.
Mr. Vittum.
Here.
Mr. Schuman.
Here,
and Mr. Austin.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you very much, Mr. Boswell. Attached to your agenda are the minutes of the September 24th, 2018 meeting. Has everyone had an opportunity to review those?
I move we approve.
Second?
Second.
Any additional discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, I need to abstain since I was not at the meeting.
All right.
Should probably abstain too, since I was not at that meeting.
Everyone else is voting aye.
Right.
Very good. All right, Ms. McConnell, we're going to hear from you just in a half a second. Next on our agenda is public comment time. Appears that you're the only person from the public here, so we'll dispense with that tonight and move on to your certificate of appropriateness. If you'd like to come up to the desk, the application is for certificate of appropriateness, Polished Diamond LLC, Leap of Faith, I like that name, Leap of Faith LLC, owner Melissa McConnell. Representative of COA request to change the exterior paint color, located at 909 West Main Street here in Abingdon, tax map number 016-4-1. I looked at your application. This is the former Mexican restaurant on the west end of town, is that correct? And I understand it is currently bright pink and a very nice green color, lime green.
Yes, it is.
And your proposal is to change that to a light gray with black trim. How boring can you get? Those are samples.
These are the samples, yes, sir.
Okay. And the roof is going to be black?
The roof is black, all the metal, because right now it's like well, I didn't know I needed this, so I didn't know to not do this, but it was multiple shades of red and brown and all that stuff. The gray that you see there is the primer that they have put on to apply the black, so it will all be black where the metal goes around. And down the sides of the building, there is like an awning over the front entrance that's metal that kind of comes out there, but all of that will be black. And where you see lime green will be black with, yes. And then the front of this building, can I go over there?
Yes, ma'am, you sure can.
Like these here will all get painted in black, and this through here is all black back to where this attaches to this area. And then from here around, everywhere you see pink will be gray, and these green windows will then be trimmed in black.
And to explain to the Planning Commission, your understanding was that there weren't any structural changes, you didn't have to apply for a COA.
Yes, sir.
And then found we were going to paint, or you were going to paint, and that changed the
Right.
situation.
Yes, sir.
Just wanted everyone to understand that. Okay. Anyone have any questions, Ms. McConnell? Anyone have a motion to change bright pink and lime green to light green black?
So moved.
Amen.
Second. Mr. Bradley will second that. Any additional discussion? If not, all in favor say aye. And opposed.
Now, if I may, are you actually polishing diamonds in this location?
No, I wish, then I wouldn't have to work every day, but people ask me that all the time. They come in because I have decor with little fake diamonds everywhere, and they're like, are these real? It's like, I only wish.
Yeah.
No, we do nails, and we do
Oh, okay.
facials and massages, the typical spa environment. But with this location, we're expanding, so I'll have a hair salon, and we're adding a cafe, so it'll be a little restaurant for lunch.
Okay.
You're currently located at the Old Magic Mart
Yes, sir.
Center.
Now, I asked Ms. McConnell before we got started tonight, how long have we held her up to decide on paint colors? And so far, it's been about 2 weeks. I wonder if there's not a way we can short circuit this process a little bit and find a way to Jason, maybe you can come up with a way,
I agree with that 100%.
some kind of standard paint color, paint scheme, that we can agree on historic paint colors
Right.
that we can agree on, you know.
Yeah, when,
You just pick and choose from this,
for the historic district, we have a waiver, a certificate of waiver.
Yeah, okay.
For those types of small repair and maintenance issues, and I think that's a fantastic idea to try to come up with something.
Yeah,
like that.
'cause
So we don't hold up
Right.
people like Ms. McCollum.
Just, I mean, if I can speak just a
Yes,
second.
ma'am.
Just to give you kind of like an out, just because I didn't know I had to do this, which he explained to me, if you go through a realtor to purchase property in the town, apparently that's like, they give you a list, but where I didn't use a realtor, it was a owner-buy situation, directly between he and I didn't have access to any of that, and so I didn't know where to, I mean, I guess I could have called the town and asked, what do I need to do? But that really is open-ended, you know, and I don't know how to sift through, who would have known to look for that kind of thing. But, you know, because I didn't and went forward, the painters were on site, so it's cost me a lot of extra money, and the primer and all that was applied has now washed off because of the rain, so I have to rebuy all that. So it's just kind of, you know, been a little bit of a hindrance, you know.
Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
yeah, thank you very much. I'm sorry
Sure.
that we caused you some difficulty, but I hope we will find a way to remedy that.
Sure.
And that's what we're about here. right
When you
now.
mentioned it to me, I do have a suggestion just to throw out there. I mean, we all have electronic mail these days, and you guys all have the pictures that Scott took, and so, or Jason, sorry, Jason.
That's okay.
Maybe they could be emailed to everybody with the application, just to say, you know, because my painters may not have gotten upset had it been just a few hours or maybe even the next day or something, but having to get back on the schedule might be an issue, you know, with the cold weather too, so. But just, you know, email, as long as it could be emailed, and I have the paint colors and the things, so they could have been scanned in, you know, so that might be a way around it, I don't know.
We all learn from our mistakes.
Right. Right.
Thank you
I
for
appreciate
being-
your
Oh, you're
input. Thank
welcome.
you so much.
Thank you for
Sure.
helping us with this.
You're welcome, thank you guys. What do I need to do now?
You're good. You'll get a letter from me. You're good to go. You're approved. You'll get a letter from me.
So I can call the painters and have
Yes,
them start
ma'am.
tomorrow,
Yes, ma'am.
if they will? Okay.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Take care. Have a good evening.
You too.
So would it be agreeable for us to get Jason to look at ways that we can find some way, standard way of approval?
Yeah, because this is an interesting situation, because like you say, she didn't buy through realtor, she already had a business license because she operates her business in a different location.
Sure.
So it's one of those things where it is, you know, there are ways that, like little safety nets, but certainly didn't apply here, and,
And I can tell you, the contractor was not happy with me.
yeah.
I'm sure he was.
Yeah, well, you just take, I mean, you just take when something like that happens, because it's, you know, I mean, something like this to go from what it was to what it is, certainly wasn't gonna be controversial.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I told him, you know, I have no doubt that it would be approved, anything's better than pink and lime green. But, yeah, I think we do need to try to come up with a process to,
I was surprised that something that far out even required approval of a color.
It's all the approaches to the historic.
It's an overlay.
Well, she probably would've been cheaper just to go ahead and keep painting and then take a fine or something.
Fine, yeah.
I'm not even joking.
There's something in the ordinance though about having a fine for every day you're in violation.
Yeah, we don't, we were, that's
So
not
that
what
could
we're
add up.
looking to do, if we can
Yeah,
get
that would not be
filed
good.
with it. We don't wanna find somebody every day unless they're being extremely
Right,
non-compliant.
right.
But this lady just didn't know.
All right. Mr. Bell, glad you were able to make it. You're next on our agenda.
Here I am.
Yes, sir, and again, thank you for coming. We wanted to discuss this issue that seems to be an age-old issue involving the Kroger gas station convenience store. A brief part of the history of that, and I will I'll share that, and we'll let any of the other planning commissioners that want to add to it speak about it. Kroger came to us, and they wanted the appropriate certificate for them to be able to proceed with their convenience store or gas station, and with the COA. And we looked at it, and there was some concern on the planning commission at the time, first of all, due to the location of it. But second of all, due to safety concerns. And the two major safety concerns that the planning commission had at that time was adding a gas tanker truck coming up Cummings Street at any point in time just logically did not seem to make sense to us, and we had concerns about that with traffic as bad as it is anyway. And second of all, with the design that they presented to us, there were certain parking places over near Shoney's that just seemed to be virtually unusable if they tried to utilize them in the manner in which they presented it to us on the plat. And so what we did at that time, long story short, it's probably too late for that now, was number one, limit the time that the tanker truck could come in and do that, that is refill the tanks. And second of all, ask them to change the plat such that the parking spots, instead of parking at an angle where people would be backing into the lane of travel of people that were at the gas station, to require those to be vertical, so to speak, to the building itself, and hopefully avoid possible crashes in that area. We issued the certificate of appropriateness specifically based upon those two requirements. They appealed that to the town council, and the town council largely upheld it, although they did change the dates and the times that the tanker truck could come in and replenish the tanks. But
And I read the minutes, and I've actually watched the video from the town council meeting about those provisions, and it actually, I'm not sure exactly why Kroger handled it this way, but the times that are in, that ultimately became in the certificate of appropriateness are times that Kroger proposed. Mr. Hutton represented them, and they had a witness, and those were things that they agreed to
yes.
at the time. I'm not
Yes.
sure why they did that other than trying to get it through, but yeah, I've seen all that.
So since that period of time, all of us who drive by there have seen regular violations of those times, and they have never complied with changing the parking in the manner that they agreed to do that. And I read what you had written in terms of the opinion, and one thing that I wanted to bring out very quickly, you said in the opinion that you wrote, is if there was evidence that they never intended to comply with those restrictions from the beginning, that perhaps your opinion might change to some extent. And at least I personally believe that that's exactly what we have. They never intended to comply because, number one, they never changed the painting of the location of the parking spots first. And second of all, we have come to find that they have a system on their tanks that automatically notifies the supplier when the tank gets to a certain level, and that's when the truck comes. It doesn't have anything to do with what day or time that they agreed to refill those tanks. It's when the tank gets low, that's when the truck comes, and it's an automatic system that reorders the gasoline for them. Now, again, going back to I'm not speaking for the planning commission here, but I'm speaking personally. I have seen that tanker truck up there at times that I cringed as I went by. Race day was one of them. And I just think that it is a recipe for disaster with a truck trying to turn back toward the interstate after refilling the tanks there. And my concern at the time, the reason that I brought it up when I was on the planning commission at that time, is I didn't want that responsibility on myself or on the planning commission. If we have some accident there, and if we do have an accident there, it'll be catastrophic in nature. And I'm not predicting that it may be explosive in nature, but it'll be catastrophic in nature. Somebody's cutting across Cummings Street, people are coming down through there.
Sure.
So from my perspective, that's what the concerns are. And the reason that we wanted to talk with you about it is we felt somewhat in a hopeless situation if we put restrictions on a COA and the people that we put the restrictions on the COA didn't comply with it. What good does it do us to sit here and talk about it and impose those restrictions and to try to legislate to some extent what we believe as a planning commission is appropriate?
Yeah, I would say I agree. You know, Wayne and I both opposed the location. I think we were the only planning commissioners to do that for those particular reasons. Because again, like I looked at the parking particular. If you look at it, you know, all you have to do is see somebody backing out and not paying attention, and they back right into the lane where people are leaving the gas and go. And one of the things that occurred to me was you have two such different issues. You've got people who are going to the gas and go and people who are going to the Shoney's. And it's not like some of these gas and goes where it's a gas and go in a convenience store. You've got two different situations. So it seemed to me the way the parking was done was inherently dangerous. And I agree with Wayne. You know, if something happens with that tanker truck, and I think it was pretty clear that if Kroger didn't agree to do what they promised to do, that they may not have gotten the COA, so they promised to do it, and they never had any intention. And when we have had to reach out to them to come back here to deal with us, they just don't respond. So it, you know, and I will say one other thing that is we had a similar situation not too long ago with the man who was developing what was the old in-towner there. And he didn't do what the COA required. And of course, he had to come back here. We actually pulled the COA for a period of time until he did comply. So that was one time where that was done, just as a...
Well, I appreciate that, and I think I understand that are your concerns, and I sort of started from the beginning as to what the Planning Commission has the power to do. And I focused on the times. There was some comment about the parking spaces that wasn't the Shoney's parcel separate than the fuel center thing about the parking?
That was on Shoney's COA, which that's something that we can go to the building official, and if we have to, pull their CO, or them not complying with the parking. So that's something that we can address.
Right. So the empowering ordinances are, and I guess you guys have seen this memorandum. I won't repeat it all to you, but you know, it is what in the Historic District Entrance Corridor Overlay District, the Planning Commission has the authority to impose, and it's largely architectural and in nature. So I just didn't see from the get-go, and I understand you guys' concerns, but how the Planning Commission had the authority in the first place to say what could come in there and how it could come in there. You do have authority to talk about parking and some other things, but whether a tractor trailer can come in there or not, as long as it doesn't affect the site plan itself, I don't think the Planning Commission had the authority to do that in the first place. As it went along, and that's sort of where I went at the end, is that for whatever reason, Kroger sort of said, okay, we feel like we're not going to get beyond what you've decided, and so we'll go along with some restrictions that they said were reasonable at the time, and that's sort of a separate thing. But if you start from, if somebody came in brand new and it was the same situation and you said, you know, you can't come in for these certain periods of time, I don't think that the Planning Commission really has the power to say that in a COA. And then from a procedural mechanism, and I think this is sort of where Jason comes in, is what is there out there that I can enforce? What can I point to and say, this is on a sheet of paper that I have the authority to enforce? And so, for instance, that when we're talking about things like parking, then the mechanism of the paperwork is there's a site plan. And so you can point to the site plan and say, hey, these two parking spaces are not like they're on the plan, and then Jason can go in and say your building permit and your certificate of occupancy are based on this site plan, and it's violative of that, and so he can use his own enforcement mechanism. Where you've got this thing that sort of it lies outside of it that's just added on, and I guess maybe technically, even though I think it probably was beyond the authority of the commission to do this, if somebody had handwritten at the bottom of the site plan or had something on the building permit or certificate of occupancy, you can only deliver to these times, then at least Jason would be in a better position to say, this is what I'm enforcing. But I think you're sort of in a hard place in, there isn't really anybody who can say. I would ultimately guess that's a VDOT issue as to who can come and go at certain periods of time. But I don't know that council really has the authority really to legislate or condition a permit on who can come and go at certain times. So I feel your distress, and I don't disagree that that's a bad spot to be in, but I'm not sure that this body is the one who can do it. And I think, Kenny, the difference, and I'm not familiar with all the stuff with the in-towner, but I think the difference there is what I'm saying. That was the parking space, that was on a site plan. You can say, hey, you didn't follow the site plan, and so Jason's office can go through and enforce that.
In terms of the situation with Kroger's, does the fact that they agreed and that was part of the council minutes and all that they agreed to do that, would that matter?
Well, so, and Mr. Austin's the authority on mens rea, but is, you know, there is a provision in one of the ordinances if somebody makes false statements, representations, or certifications in any record, that they're guilty or liable in this article. So in theory, the town could file some enforcement action against Kroger, but as I see it, the burden of proof would be that they knew it to be false at the time. My guess is the easy defense to that would say, oh, well, this guy came and he didn't realize that this was how the ordering system worked, and we didn't do it on purpose, and it doesn't matter because you didn't have the authority to make us do this anyway. So in theory, that's an avenue, but a long shot, and maybe not a fight we want to fight. It seems to me, and this was one of my suggestions to Mr. Sullivan at the time, was, you know, why don't you shame the Kroger people? They came in and said in front of YouTube and everybody that they would agree to these times, and now we have all this evidence that you have not. Now, I don't know that there's a whole lot of teeth to that. And I understand, I think Mr. Sullivan contacted Mr. Hutton, who was their counsel at the time, and he informed them that he would try to get in touch with them, but that was sort of a one-off representation of them, so they didn't have a whole lot of communication with wherever those people from Kroger came from, Ohio. So that's sort of where I think it stays. You know, there might be some other amendment to the historic overlay district that council might empower somebody to have that authority, but at the moment I'm not sure that lies within anybody within the town.
So if we, and I don't mean this critically, I understand what you're saying, but I go back and I think about it, if we were convinced that it was an ultra dangerous situation, that's really not a relevant inquiry for the planning commission to make. As long as they've got their landscaping and their trees right, we got to give them a COA, even if we know they're going to have the potential for some disaster.
I think
that's not our decision.
Well, I think, and Jason, I don't know if you've had this situation, or Ken, if you have or not, but I mean, it seems to me that would be a VDOT call as to whether the entrance would be proper under VDOT statutes, would be the bailiwick of whose decision that would be.
I would assume that it is, but I don't say that.
And there might be, maybe the police have some authority over that. Maybe I haven't looked at that angle, but maybe that would be how it would fall in. And I would guess that, and I see your distinction here certainly in the location of it, but there are lots of other fuel stations along that road.
Maybe at that time, it may have been best to, make it a right in, right out, instead of trying to, because we definitely could have done that.
Yeah, we definitely have that authority,
Definitely
because
have
we've done
that
that
authority.
before, where we
It's
say you have to have right in, right out
only.
only, you cannot turn left
You
down
cannot
there,
turn left.
but
Yeah, that's something that could have been.
And we removed one of the entrances No, there was an entrance, if you're looking at Shoney's, there was an entrance right below Kroger's where you could come in and out, and that entrance was removed as part of the negotiation. And so you got the one big entrance there, right in front of Shoney's basically, and then you've got the way you can come in off of Cumming Street to take a right into the Gas and Go. But when that was designed, they did close off one of the exits. Of course, it's not relevant to this particular discussion, but it is, that's how we got to the one big entrance exit, and then the one coming, you take a right off of Cummings into the Gas and Go.
And there is consideration of the parking lot access and size, but I think that's to
Well,
your
we
point.
lost the old Stuckey's property, Popeyes was back on the end, but the standard says that you can't have an entrance that close to an interstate entrance, so it had to be a right in, right out. And Popeyes said, see, we not doing
Well, I
that. I
think
mean, those types of things we can do.
if VDOT was asked to look into it, they would probably just be looking at like sight distance. You know, is there proper
That
sight
would
distance?
definitely
And
come
from a
into play.
truck's viewpoint, yes, there's plenty of sight distance there. Just when it's heavy traffic, it's a little hairy.
And we do have restrictions as to how close that entrance can be to an intersection. But I
Right,
think that this
right.
one qualifies for that barely. But
And we do have restrictions for tractor and trailers through the town. I mean, for local delivery purposes, they're notified of that.
That's largely unenforced.
Yeah.
But enforceable. It's just not enforceable, I don't think.
Sure it is. Start pulling a few of them over, the word will get around real quick. Because it's not the one guy that comes every 6 months, it's the KVAC guys that come through there all the time as a shortcut. It's the same old guys. I've talked to Tony about it many times, and really it's not the reason they're not allowed in town is not a traffic issue, it's a structural issue with the roads.
Right.
The roads in town are not built to handle weight. So it's important to keep them out from that.
Even the turning radiuses that are necessary.
Yeah, sure.
Because they're running over the edges of all the sidewalks
That's right,
and things.
that's right. So you've got a lot of these local companies and distributors that they could care less. They run those trucks in and out of there when they shouldn't. So I would say that the enforcement, if they hit up some of those companies that are constant violators, they would squelch that pretty quick.
And I appreciate the concern of this group. I remember, I think it was 1969 or 70, when a locomotive struck a gas.
It's a bus truck, yeah.
And boy, it was a real problem down here.
And that whole,
There
that
was an
crossing of the
explosion.
tracks is gone, that, where it
Yeah.
happened.
Yeah.
They-
That
Closed
crossing
it off,
job,
yeah. Was that
There was
Steep
almost a
Road?
really bad situation.
Mhm.
Was that the Crow House, or not, Steep Road?
No, it wasn't, if this
When
was,
it's at Parents' House.
I was gonna say, it was Mr. DeBuck that got hurt in the accident, wasn't it?
No, it was a Hamilton Oil Company.
Oh, okay.
It's over there on Colonial Road. Truck belonging to them. But that was almost a really, there was an explosion, but it was almost even worse than the fire department.
Yeah, fire department.
Contained. It was a serious situation. That potentially exists over here, I'm afraid. But, Mr. Bell, certain is right, you know, we don't have that authority, although we tried.
We'll start counting trees and not gas.
Parking space. You don't know how many times I've sat and counted parking spaces.
Well, one thing I do think though, and I guess this would be a different way to approach it. And it gets back, this goes back to, I think we could say that when you look at the site plan, that the site plan itself, from its location, is not appropriate to the use that, for which they are applying. We, you know, something, would that be something you could do?
And that's more of a zoning issue, but depending on the situation.
And
And I, you know, I go back into an argument at one point where there was a church that wanted to have a parking lot. They wanted it across the street from the church. It ended up being approved, but, you know, what you had was a situation where the parking lot was not appropriate to be across the street because you were crossing a busy street to get to a church. It seemed to me that that was inappropriate because of the danger it caused the people in the, and frankly, all I did was make 200 Methodists mad and passed it anyway, but, you know.
Well, that doesn't take much.
And, you know, now you know I probably enjoyed it, but still, you know, I think that the issue was it's not an appropriate use for that particular piece of land. And that was part of the discussion, actually. You know,
I
that,
think it'll help alleviate what Mr. Sheehan.
you know, one thing that was never questioned though was whether or not those tanks should be in the filling area. You know, but if you look at it, the whole, I think that was the big problem that Wayne and I had with it. It just was not appropriate use site for what they wanted to do with it. And I think ultimately that's the real. You get down to the bottom line of it, whether it's parking or the entrance with a tanker truck, it wasn't, you know.
Yeah.
Because you do have other gas and goes, but you don't have location issues like that.
But it comes down to the property's owned B2, and the gas stations are allowed in B2, and there's not really much of a way you can turn it down unless it just doesn't fit the site.
We were having sort of a side discussion here. I think that you can look into, as they were saying, the Shoney's site plan, and if you think that those particular parking spaces are inappropriate.
And I think that's good, but again, you know, just.
It doesn't get to the issue except
Yeah, this is,
sort
I
of
mean,
sideways.
it's a danger in the parking situation to a person or persons. The tanker truck potentially causes a much greater potential for, you know, a catastrophic situation.
Yeah.
Any other questions, Mr. Bell? Thank you, Cam, appreciate
Yes.
you being here.
Sorry to be, when I was a law clerk in Knoxville, they used to call me Bad News Bell because I only had bad answers. My reputation is consistent anyway.
Don't let the door hit you.
I'll contact.
Keep me out of trouble.
I'll contact you tomorrow. We've got a few things we need to discuss.
Great, all right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Cam. All right, next on our agenda is an update on the comprehensive plan.
Exciting stuff here, guys. We had a really good turnout on proposals. We ended up with 7. Myself and 5 other department heads scored them. Got that number down to 3. EPR out of Charlottesville, Hill Studios out of Roanoke, and McBride Dale Clarion out of Cincinnati, Ohio. All 3 very good proposals. They met all the requirements of the RFP. I brought copies of the proposals if you all would like to take a look at them. They're here. I've got enough that I could give you each individual ones if you want them. I think we just kick around the idea of when we could set up the interview process and how many of you all would like to participate. Mr. Bradley, I would like for you to participate.
I volunteer.
Thank you, sir. And Kenny, I would like for you to participate as well. And Scott, I think you showed some interest in wanting to be on it.
Sure.
And we'll probably have the Director of Finance and Treasurer there, Chuck Maynard, and Matthew Bullock for his expertise in transportation. Just to name a few, we may have more than that. But we were thinking maybe call all 3 in, call 2 of them in. The 2 that ranked the highest were EPR up Charlottesville and McBride Dale Clarion. In the way we scored.
Was there a large gap between the top 2 and the third one?
There was not a large gap between the top 3. They were pretty clear in front of everybody else.
I think I'd call in all 3 then. You know, again, if there's not a big gap between number 2 and number 3.
Yeah, there's not. Thinking about bringing them in for 40 minutes presentation with maybe a 15 to 20 minute Q&A afterwards, if that's acceptable to you all. So I'll work out the logistics with the firms and get in contact with you all on the date that we're gonna bring them in. We're gonna try to do it one day. Start 9-ish in the morning. Have 2 before lunch and 1 after. That works.
All right, so you'll be in contact by
Yes, sir.
email with everyone.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much.
And Kenny, I think you.
Yeah,
Go right ahead, sir.
okay, we've had a couple of discussions here about two things that involve the Economic Development Authority. One, there's been some discussion about what was going on in town and who was doing what, and the fact that there seemed to be a lot of empty spaces in town. And so one of the things that Tony Triplett, who is the Director of Economic Development, gave me that I want to give to the members, and you can pass a couple down. It's just her report that she did for the town, for the council, on activity that's been going on from her department the past few months. And I thought this would be good for the folks on the planning commission to see. Let's see, I think that's, everybody will have one if that works. Is that right? There are 3 of them.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to go into that, but I do think it is good. For those of you who don't get to work with Tanya, I think she does a really good job with economic development. And one of the things, and how these things work between what she does, what the EDA does, and what we do, is that, for example, when we had the situation with the Cinemall and the development of the restaurant there, she worked pretty closely with Mr. Weston on, came back and talked to her about what he should do in his presentation here. And I thought he did a good job after working with her. So I think that's an important thing to know, that there's activity going on between those two. You know, there are times when economic development sort of runs against the planning commission in terms of what we do, because we have to be sure that certain things, certain I's are dotted and T's crossed before we can approve some of these things. At the same time, the town doesn't want to do away with a lot of revenue in terms of economic development because of the need for the tax structure. But I do think it's important for folks to know that what's going on, and I think that's a good report. The second thing I want to talk about is the Economic Development Authority recently put together a report for the town. I'm going to give you all a copy of it. And you can pass these down as far as, I think there's enough for everybody. But I did want to talk about this a little bit, because this does also have a direct correlation between what the EDA is doing and sometimes the Planning Commission does. The EDA is an independent authority, but the appointees come from the town council. There are 7 appointees, and unlike the Planning Commission, there's nobody from the town that necessarily sits on the EDA. But we do have 4 folks that come to our meetings. I guess the best way to say it would be their ex officio. That would be Tanya Triplett, who's the Economic Development Director, Jane During, who is the Tourism Director, and then in addition to that, Carrie Baxter, who is the Director from Abingdon Main Street, and Lisa Quigley, who is the new Executive Director of the Creeper Trail. It's called, I guess it's still called the Club, but it's moving away from that to be more encompassing in terms of its fundraising ability, and that she's the first executive director of that. So they come to the meetings, and what we have done over the past several months has been to talk about different things in the town. And one of the project that we wanted to undertake, and that's what this is to go out and interview some local, started with the largest employers in the town, and we decided to use and interview only those employers that were basically local. So for example, when we interviewed grocery stores, we interviewed Food City and Food Country. We didn't interview Kroger's or Food Line because of who owns what. And we were trying to determine some of the things that these folks thought were important. What we did was we developed a questionnaire. we developed an introduction paragraph so that all the folks would be told the same things. And then the different members of the EDA went out and did the interviews. And it came down to, there were 5 common themes, and I'm going to mention those. One, it is difficult to work with the town to start a business or modify an existing structure. And we just heard a little bit about that, as it's timely. Second, this is the first time anyone has ever reached out to me to solicit my thoughts on economic development. And these people gave a lot of time. These were over an hour interviews or more, and they were really forthcoming, and they really appreciate the fact that we did this. Third, the town has been complacent in terms of its efforts for economic development. The town has rested on its reputation for too long. 4, the restrictive nature of the Historic Properties Review Board has discouraged investment in the historic district, while at the same time there are properties which are clearly out of compliance with the requirements of the HPDR. And this one, along with number 1, was probably raised the most ire. And then number 5, it's hard to locate information on rental housing. So those were the takeaways in terms of what they found. Now, we put together what they said and came up with a group of 9 recommendations, some of which are being worked on now, and that's on page 4. The first one is better communication of what is expected in terms of rules and requirements. Present the rules and requirements up front and tell businesses what they need to do to open a business. Don't mince words. Inform businesses that in order to preserve our character, we require that architectural features be incorporated to enhance our overall character. Limit the use of terms. You know, I think, like, for example, we talk about overlay. That's something that you have to explain to a potential business. Second, consider offering incentives for business. I will tell you that the EDA has talked about that quite a bit. That's a tricky thing to do. The town of Wytheville has a very well-ordered group of incentives that they use. When we looked at that, we thought it was pretty good, but it almost is limiting. So we've left that sort of open-ended. I will tell you that the EDA looked at the potential for small business loans through the EDA and rejected that because it would make the EDA like a bank. But we do think that there are times when that's appropriate. Don't be afraid to say we want your business here and we're going to help you. The entry cost of opening a small shop or business is daunting. Make it easy. Adopt an attitude of helping people to invest in Abingdon. Practice improved customer hospitality service. And I will tell you, Tanya does a good job with that. But that is an important thing. I think for a long time there's been the attitude, well, you know, Abingdon's a great town, so if people want to locate here, they'll come to us. I think when you look at what rural economic development and the issues we have in our area with the demise of the coal industry and so forth, we have to be more proactive. Consider maximizing use of the Barter Green to establish a bustling town square atmosphere. Continue to offer facade improvement opportunities in partnership with business owners and or building owners to improve aesthetics that will attract additional customers as well as additional businesses. The first part of that, first 3 businesses that got grants from the EDA, that's been done. We have another round of that coming up where there are, Main Street Avenue's gotten grant money, and we're going to be looking at doing additional businesses for facade improvement. Once those facades are actually designed, they actually have to come here for our approval. And that happened with the first 3, but it will continue to happen. But what we're looking at is that the EDA investment in this, because you require grant funds or matching funds, plus the owner of the business has to put money into it. Normally what we're looking at is $1 that the EDA would invest for every $5 that would be the grant money coming from the shop owner, the business owner. Work with banks or other financial institutions to identify sources of capital for prospective businesses or business expansion. Involve local business, commercial real estate owners, potential businesses, commercial lenders, and investors in a cooperative atmosphere to foster new growth. Recommend a review of the Historic Preservation Review Board guidelines to make sure they are clear, realistic, and promote growth in the historic district. And I want to talk about that a minute because there are 2 things that really come out in this discussion. One is that the Historic Preservation Board at times is so restrictive that it basically may even go against what it is they're ultimately trying to do, because either somebody comes in and fixes up a building or it sits there. And so if it's so restrictive that people aren't fixing up buildings because the requirements are so restrictive, then they're not doing what they need to do. And the second thing, and this was the thing that really came out a lot, is again, it's the Hutton property, the idea that you have properties that are clearly out of compliance. And one thing that when that was discussed came to my mind is we have a really odd situation, and that is, if you go to the Historic Preservation Review Board, you have to go through their review process, and then what you do is approved. If you ignore them, then you've got the same issue, because there are things that they cover. So let's say you go in and you do something, you actually go in affirmatively, and there was an issue where somebody put in box guttering where there was supposed to be rolled steel. Well, when that happens, that's a violation that can be dealt with. So those two things work. What doesn't work is if you, A, don't get caught when you do something, then obviously you don't get punished. But B, if your property just becomes dilapidated, like the Hutton property, what happens is that the code enforcement only gets to the point of it being dilapidated, so you can do the minimum, it remains dilapidated, but it has no relation to what other people do within the historic district. So your code enforcement for a dilapidated building does not at all match what the requirements are for people who own property in the historic district. And I think that's where, you know, the ordinances may need to be reviewed, because that's clearly an issue where, you know, where we've had issues talking about code enforcement, and in that situation, the minimum is done, and then we don't have anything we can do. And it also is not a situation where the Historic Preservation Board can come in and say, hey, you know, you gotta fix up your property. So the minimum, when the minimum is done, you could literally have people who just decide to let their property become dilapidated and never do anything. And the Hutton property is not the only place that's happened. It's just that it's one of the ones that's never been bought, changed, and, you know, the Patton House for years was like that. But, you know, it is an interesting situation, but what we saw was the perception of the people we interviewed was that the failing was of the Historic Property Review Board, not of the fact that there wasn't a good way to handle a property like that. So, and then the last one is update the website, and I think that's being done. I think a lot of #1 better communications being done. I think a lot of this is being addressed. But I will say, as the chair of the Economic Development Authority, I was pleased with this. What I did is I went back to the people I interviewed and gave them copies of this so that they would see what was presented, and I got a nice response from that. I think it's something you could have paid a consultant to do to get some of the same information, so I hope this is helpful, but I did think it would be important to share it, both because of the discussions we have here and also because we're going to be talking in the not too distant future about the comprehensive plan. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
So on the common themes, where comment is it's very difficult to work with a town to start business or modify an existing structure. And I can tell you, if you drill down, most of the time, it's because these are people that have never gotten a building permit before. They don't understand. There's fire codes, there's stormwater regulations. Those are state things, those are not town things. But they get mad at the town. I mean, I can tell you different restaurants have been open. They're furious at the town, but the town is enforcing, you know, you've got to have the hood in the kitchen. It's like $40,000 with all the fire extinguishing equipment. It's not the town, it's code. But they don't understand it because they've never done anything anywhere else.
Well, but I think one of the things that they were saying, and these folks are people who've been in business for a while, it's more that the way it was communicated was of concern. You know, it was communicated in a way that people who didn't have that understanding, that the time wasn't taken to make sure they had the understanding. Because I mean, what you're saying is absolutely correct. You can't just ignore it, And the other thing you can't do is, you know, you've got buildings, the way buildings are supposed to look, you can't ignore that either. But I think what you have to do, and what people saw, is that the way it was communicated, it could have been communicated in a more, a better way to make sure that they understood what it is that they would have to do. And I think one of the things that's being done in terms of when businesses come to, like, the economic development person, more of that's being done. I think you guys are working on a one-page type of thing, so the communication is better to the businesses. I think it's not
We plan on
the
sitting down.
message, it's how the message was delivered.
We also plan on sitting down with the Association of Realtors to let them better understand, you know, when they are selling these properties, what the rules and regulations are. Again, we don't make those rules, we just try to enforce them.
And I think the way they're explained to the prospective business owner is important.
Yes.
You know, because you know, again, you look at certain things that you could use for incentives, and not necessarily the kitchen type of equipment, but there are some things you might do for incentives in terms of, you know, like the facade, that type of thing, where you might be able to work with somebody and there might be some money available either through the facade improvement program or something like that. And I think that's the kind of thing that you need to, you know, to get across. I think at times it's been more of a downer maybe than it needed to be, and that was what was being expressed. I mean, I think that's, again, some of what you hear is, it's like the issue with the, you know, the Historic Preservation Board. It's a viewpoint, but those viewpoints are important when you start to talk about how you're gonna attract businesses to the town, at the same time making sure that you don't just say, well, gosh, we really want to have you, so don't worry about any of this stuff. Definitely can't do that. But I do think it's the way the message is
I mean, Ms.
delivered.
McConnell's a perfect example.
Yeah.
We obviously want her business in town, we want as much business in town as we can get. And I think the majority of people that we've worked with, at least in the last year and a half since I've been in this role, would say that it's been a positive experience. But we do have those situations where they don't know the rules, and you gotta go out and tell them, you know, it's fantastic that you want to paint it, but you have to get approved, and they don't want to hear that.
Well, and I agree with Al, something like a color like that. You know, one time, all the signage came before the planning commission, and what they decided, and I'm not sure exactly how that ordinance was changed, but basically it said that the signage would be, you know, that would go to staff as opposed to the planning commission unless there was something, you know, and I think that you could do the same thing with exterior colors.
You can use all the paint companies have historic paint colors. And if they stick to an established historic paint color, there may be no more than 3 different colors, then why not allow it? And let Jason go on with it, and if it meets those qualifications, we just need to sit down and
Something like that would
decide what those qualifications are.
It definitely make my job easier, and it definitely should make it easier on a lot of these businesses.
Just before the meeting, I was talking to the economic development director, and one of the things she was saying is sometimes she'll deal with someone and then sends them over to town hall because she's in a different location, and then they have to go back to another building, and then, so the person is going back and forth between offices, which can get rather confusing, and I don't know whether it's possible to have, if that person is there with the economic development director, to bring all of the staff players in with their pieces and kind of handle it as in one location.
In a perfect world, I would love to be able to talk to everybody that Tanya's talking to on a daily basis. Unfortunately, I can't do that. So a lot of times Tanya will send those people to me. And I feel pretty confident when they leave my office, they understand what it is that we require of them, and that it's not nearly as daunting as an experience as they might think that it is. Because we get a lot of people that just, they don't understand. So we try to walk them through every single step that they'll have to go through that business, try to make it as easy as possible. But it'd be more beneficial for the planning department to be able to have those type of preliminary interviews or conferences with the business owner, with Tanya, for sure.
Yeah, and I think one of the things she could do is to say, okay, she could set that meeting and make sure everybody had that was needed to be there. She could set a time and say, okay,
let me get everybody and we'll give you a time to come back to town hall.
Well, that's exactly what we do.
Yeah, and I think that's, that, you know, I think that's a
Tanya
good
had
idea.
time to tell me in advance, and she said, you know, Mr. Weston's going to do this, we need to sit down and have a conversation with him, so let's set it up and let's get him ready to go. And it works much better that way.
And that, I think one of the things that that allows to happen, depending on the size of the building, is that may be a situation where Tanya or you could look at a potential, what an incentive might be. What could be done, you know, if there was that need, particularly if it was a business that, the type of business that wasn't located here now, you know. But I didn't mean to take too much of your time, but
No, that's fantastic information, Mr. Schuman, I appreciate it.
Well done, Mr. Schuman. I like it. All we need is another 4 stories on this building and a parking garage.
All right, is there anything else to go before the planning commission? Not, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
so moved.
Second? All in favor?
Aye.